Sacred Heart Hospital in Raleigh smells like antiseptic and burnt coffee at 0600. Laura Bennett arrives in scrubs 2 sizes too big, her name badge reading only RN with no credentials listed. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects trapped in glass, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that makes time feel negotiable. The ICU corridor stretches empty. Her boots, worn tactical boots she'd swapped for nursing clogs years ago, make almost no sound on the linoleum worn smooth by 1,000 shifts before her. She walks with a barely perceptible limp, favoring her left leg. Most people don't notice. The ones who do never ask. In the ICU break room, she sits alone at 0540, 16 minutes before her shift officially starts. The fluorescent overhead flickers. Once. Twice. She doesn't look up. Her hands rest on the table in front of her, scarred hands, calloused across the knuckles and the heels, the kind of hands that have held things together in the dark. Her left hand trembles slightly as she reaches into her jacket lining and touches something there. A patch. Faded. Unit designation barely visible anymore after 16 years pressed against her ribs through every shift, every morning, every night she couldn't sleep. Ramadi. 2004, a Naval Special Warfare Command. She withdraws her hand. The trembling stops immediately, as if she'd simply turned off a switch. She pours black coffee into a chipped mug that says nothing and sits in the corner where the security camera has a blind spot. 2 years. She's been here exactly 2 years and 4 days. Other nurses whisper about her in the hallway, whispers she can hear perfectly well from 3 rooms away, though she never acknowledges them. They say she never talks about her past. Never goes to the annual staff holiday party. Never mentions a family or a hometown or a life before Sacred Heart. They say she always volunteers for the overnight shifts, the ones nobody wants, the stretches of 12 hours that stretch into 14 when codes run long. They say she's strange. Quiet in a way that feels intentional. Like she's constructed walls and then forgotten the gates. None of them are wrong. At 0700, Dr. Sterling arrives for rounds. His white coat is pressed sharp enough to cut. Cardiothoracic attending, 15 years at Sacred Heart, board connections that trace upward like vines through the hospital administrative structure, golf outings on Saturdays with hospital board members whose first names he calls out like he owns them. He's 47 and moves through the ICU the way a man moves through spaces that have been arranged specifically for him, with the easy confidence of someone who has never encountered a door that wouldn't open. He notices Laura checking a central line on a post-op cardiac patient. Her technique is wrong, too precise, too economical, the movements too economical in a way that suggests she's performed this particular procedure approximately 10,000 times instead of the maybe 500 a standard ICU nurse accumulates. Her hands move on their own, muscle memory that doesn't match her credentials. No medical school in that movement. No standard nursing program in that practiced efficiency. Sterling's eyes narrow. Where did you train, Bennett? His voice carries the casual lethality of a man asking a question he already knows the answer to and is simply testing the limits of your honesty. She doesn't look up from the line. Somewhere else. That's not an answer. It's the answer you're getting. Her voice is soft. Deferential, almost. Definitely not confident. The kind of voice that apologizes for existing. She finishes securing the dressing and turns to face him, and her eyes do the thing they always do in the presence of authority, they find the floor instead of his face. But in that moment before she looked down, Sterling saw something. Not weakness. Something underneath the weakness. Something that looked like it had survived things he couldn't quite categorize. He dismisses it. He categorizes her instead as a small-town nurse playing at competence, probably trained at some community college somewhere in the rural stretches of North Carolina where credentials were flexible and oversight was theoretical. He files her away as disposable. One of many. Laura moves to the next bed. Patient in post-op day 3, cardiac bypass, vitals stable but trending toward fluid overload. She checks the ventilator settings, a Philips Respironics, modern enough, well maintained, and notes the O2 saturation sitting at 94%. She adjusts the positive end expiratory pressure by 2 centimeters of water without any dramatic gestures. Just a small turn of the dial. The kind of adjustment that suggests she understands the relationship between airway pressure and gas exchange in a way that goes deeper than textbooks. The attending resident rounds with Sterling, a young man named Kowalski who still has that eager expression of someone who believes he's going to save everyone if he just works hard enough. He'll lose that in 5 years. Or he'll find ways to protect it. Depends on what he learns from the people he works for. Sterling asks about the patient's pressures. Kowalski recites them. Sterling nods with the satisfied expression of a man whose expectations have been met at minimum. He asks about the chest tube output. Kowalski describes serous fluid, minimal, appropriate for post-op day 3. Sterling asks if anyone has considered early extubation. Laura, who is standing at the bedside charting vitals, doesn't look up. But she stops. Small thing. The pen pauses for maybe 1/3 of a second. Barely noticeable. Kowalski hedges. The patient hasn't quite met the criteria. The attending at 0600 wanted to wait until tomorrow. Sterling's jaw tightens. He says the patient is ready. He says extubation should happen within the hour. It isn't a request. His voice has the particular steel that comes from being accustomed to having his instructions followed without the unnecessary friction of consultation. Laura finishes her notation and moves to the next bed. But her hands, when she thinks no one is looking, are trembling again. Small tremors. The kind of trembling that comes from muscle memory recognizing danger and preparing for the protocols that follow crisis. The rounds continue. Sterling moves through the ICU with Kowalski trailing behind like a remora fish following a shark. They stop at 4 more beds. At each one, Sterling makes declarations about care plans with the casual authority of someone who has never been told no. At the 4th bed, a post-op day 1 patient with unstable arrhythmias, he suggests a medication adjustment, an increased beta-blocker dose that makes Kowalski shift his weight nervously. The patient's blood pressure is already at 104/62. Beta-blockers will drop it further. The hemodynamics are borderline, sir, Kowalski says quietly. You second-guessing me, Kowalski? No, sir. Just confirming. Then confirm it by writing the order. Kowalski writes the order? The attending physician's authority is absolute. The hierarchy is not a suggestion. Laura, in the adjacent bed space, is adjusting for rates on a different patient, but her attention has subdivided. Part of her is focused on the task. Part of her is listening to that conversation and filing away the information with the particular intensity of someone whose survival has historically depended on understanding the baseline patterns of human behavior before they deviate into crisis. She doesn't look at Sterling. She doesn't look at Kowalski. She doesn't acknowledge that she's heard anything at all. She simply works. And her hands, the trembling ones, move with the precision of muscle memory that remembers field medicine in sandstorms and the particular urgency of treating combat injuries with whatever equipment was available and time that was running out. By 1000, the morning rounds are finished. The ICU settles into that rhythm that comes between the chaos of overnight and the chaos of shift change, a pocket of relative stability where the patients who are going to crash have mostly already crashed and the ones who are stable are sleeping or processing whatever medications the night shift loaded into their systems. Laura takes her break at 1015. She sits in the break room again, the one with the security camera blind spot, and touches the patch in her jacket lining again. Her fingers trace the outline. Barely there, barely visible even if someone had been looking for it. Faded fabric. Unit designation worn almost smooth. A reminder of a woman who existed before this one. A woman with rank and authority and a file somewhere in the Pentagon that listed her decorations and clearances and the names of the people she'd saved. A woman nobody at Sacred Heart knew existed. She drinks her coffee cold. She does not cry. She does not tremble where anyone can see. She simply sits in the quiet between shifts and remembers what the wall patch used to look like when it was new. The morning light filtered through the ICU windows at 0730 hours, and Sterling arrived like a general surveying conquered territory. His white coat flared as he walked, residents trailing behind him in a nervous cluster, 6 of them, fresh-faced and terrified, each holding their own patient assignments like shields. Laura stood at the nurse's station updating a chart, her movements precise, efficient, invisible. She'd learned invisibility the way soldiers learn to move through smoke. Sterling stopped directly in front of the gathered residents, his voice pitched loud enough to carry across the entire unit. "This one won't last a week," he announced, gesturing vaguely in Laura's direction without looking at her. $20 says she's gone by Friday. Who wants to take that bet? The residents laughed nervously, the sound of people who hadn't yet learned that cruelty disguised as confidence was still cruelty. Laura's pen didn't stop moving across the chart. Her hand was steady as a surgical laser, the kind of steadiness that comes from having already survived worse. The words landed where they were meant to, in her chest, in the silence between her ribs, but she didn't turn around. Didn't acknowledge. That was the trick. Never give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She finished her notes and closed the chart with a soft click. The residents watched her, uncertain. Sterling was already moving on, pulling one of them aside to criticize their assessment of a post-op patient. Laura walked to the medication dispensary and keyed in her code. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that constant electronic drone that never stopped, like the sound of institutional indifference itself. By noon, her shift had compressed into that strange rhythm of hospital work, 3 crisis moments, 7 routine checks, 1 code alert that turned out to be a monitor malfunction. The cafeteria was crowded when she went through at 1,245 hours, that thin window between lunch rush and afternoon meeting schedules. She grabbed a tray without thinking, chicken that looked like it had been deboned through sheer institutional will, green jello, black coffee. Nothing that required much hope. She moved through the line and turned toward the nurse's table, the only place where people her rank were expected to sit. Sterling sat at the doctor's table. He saw her. His eyes tracked her like a predator selecting prey from a herd. Laura walked past. She was good at walking past. She'd walked past worse things than insults. Sterling stood as she passed. His movement was theatrical, deliberate, the kind of motion designed to be noticed. He waited until she was directly beside his table, until the entire cafeteria could see what was about to happen, until the moment had maximum audience potential. Then he reached out with his right hand and knocked the tray from hers in a gesture that looked casual but wasn't. There was too much precision in it, too much aim. Too much practice. The tray fell. Chicken scattered across the tile like shrapnel. The bowl of jello hit the edge of a chair and splattered upward, coating the floor in that sickly green stain. The coffee cup broke, actually broke, and hot liquid spread across the white tile in a dark bloom. The sound was louder than it should have been, ceramic on tile, the crash of something broken in a place where everything was supposed to stay intact. The cafeteria went silent. That particular silence that falls when 50 people simultaneously stop breathing. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. All of it, every eye, every awareness in that room, swung toward Laura. This was what Sterling had been orchestrating, the moment, the audience, the power dynamic made visible. "Oops," Sterling said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Better clean that up, sweetheart." The words landed like a punch. Not because they were harsh, they weren't, they were almost gentle, but because of what they meant. The condescension. The entitlement. The absolute certainty that she would obey, that the social hierarchy meant something, that he was the architect of her humiliation and she was the one who had to clean it up. Laura took one measured breath. In through her nose, the smell of spilled coffee, institutional bleach, the copper-sharp scent of her own anger, then out through her mouth. She'd taken this breath before, in a Humvee, in a bunker, in the moment before impossible decisions. This was just a variation of the same skill set. A single tear escaped her left eye. It rolled down her cheek like a drop of rain finding its path. She didn't try to stop it. But she also didn't let it stop her. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Sterling, the gesture precise and deliberate, the kind of composure that actually terrifies people more than rage ever could. "I've cleaned up worse messes than you'll ever make," she said, and her voice, God, her voice was something else entirely. It carried weight. It carried time. It carried 20 years of authority that no scrubs could contain, 20 years of ordering people who actually listened, of making decisions that saved lives, of being someone people obeyed without question. The residents heard it. The cafeteria heard it. Sterling heard it. For just a moment, less than a second, barely long enough to notice, his expression shifted. Confusion. The look of someone who'd expected one thing and encountered something entirely different. But he recovered quickly, that institutional confidence settling back into place like armor. Laura knelt and started picking up the pieces. The broken ceramic, the scattered chicken, the mess that Sterling had made. She moved with economical grace, someone who understood that wasted motion was wasted time. Around her, the cafeteria slowly resumed its rhythm, conversations restarted, forks went back to mouths, the normal order reasserted itself. She was alone in her kneeling, alone in her cleanup, alone in her refusal to disappear. The next day brought Act 3's opening move. Sterling made rounds with his typical entourage, and when he reached the patient chart for Bay 7, he did something worse than mockery. He was past the social cruelty now, moving into something more institutional, more weaponizable. He threw the chart at her feet, actually threw it, an arc of paper and clipboard that scattered patient notes across the ICU floor like autumn leaves. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with that same false sweetness. "And next time, document properly. This is a teaching hospital, not some backwater clinic." Paper skittered across the floor. A resident bent to help, but Sterling waved him away with a sharp gesture. This was between them now. This was about establishing the rules. Laura knelt again, her movement still steady, still economical. She gathered the pages in order, she'd written them, she knew the sequence, knew what belonged where. The documentation was meticulous. 3 paragraphs on hemorrhage progression. 2 on the 2 codes she'd managed. 1 on a pneumothorax she'd caught before it became a crisis. Her handwriting was clean. Her assessments were sound. She knew it. Sterling knew it. That was what made this worse. She stood and handed him the chart, their hands not touching, the distance between them physical and professional and utterly filled with something neither of them acknowledged. "I documented 3 hemorrhages, 2 codes, and a pneumothorax in this report," she said, her voice level as glass. "You documented your golf game." His face went red. Actual crimson, a color that started at his neck and climbed toward his hairline. A resident looked away. Another one step backward. But Laura was already moving, already walking away before he could respond, already back to her patient assignments as if the exchange had never happened. By day 3, Sterling had escalated into full strategic mode. The humiliation pattern continued. He'd started calling her Nightingale in a mocking baby voice during rounds, the kind of nickname designed to strip authority from a single person in a room full of witnesses. But the real weapon was institutional. He'd begun weaponizing the system itself, the machinery that existed to protect professionals but which could be turned into a tool of destruction if you knew how to work it. He called the hospital CEO's office. Laura knew this because she overheard him in the physician's lounge. Her voice dropped to that particular tone he used when he thought no one important was listening. "I'm documenting a pattern of insubordination," he was saying into his phone. "Challenging my clinical decisions in front of residents. Creating a hostile environment. I have witnesses." By afternoon, there were preliminary performance reviews in her personnel file, documents filled with carefully worded accusations that weren't quite lies but weren't quite truths either. Challenging physician authority. Question judgment. Questionable clinical decisions. Each phrase was designed to plant seeds of doubt, each one a small seed that could grow into termination if watered with enough institutional momentum. He told the other nurses to document everything she did. "I want her gone by Monday," he said loud enough for 3 people to hear. Create a paper trail. Anything. Whatever you can document. Laura touched the patch inside her jacket, that faded unit insignia sewn into the lining of her jacket, the only thing she carried from the person she used to be. She was good at being erased. She'd spent 2 years perfecting it. But the next shift would bring something that changed everything. The next shift would bring a Marine who'd been missing from her world for 2 decades, and the moment she looked at his wrist, every wall she'd built would come crashing down. The medevac alert came through at 2,140 hours. Laura was restocking the ICU supply cart when the overhead intercom crackled, trauma activation, ICU standby, ETA for minutes, and the entire unit shifted into that practiced controlled urgency that felt like muscle memory for everyone in scrubs. A training accident, someone said. Multiple traumatic injuries. Hemorrhagic shock. The words moved through the bay like current through water, and nurses began preparing beds, laying out lines and monitors and the machinery that would decide whether a body lived or became a statistic. Laura didn't pause. Restocking continued. Hands moving, methodical, while her brain already 3 steps ahead, which bed would be open, what fluids to have ready, what the attending would ask for first. The fluorescent lights buzzed their monotonous drone above her as she checked the crash cart, mentally running through its contents, needles, syringes, medication stacked in their precise order. Everything in its place. Everything ready. The stretcher came through the trauma doors like a sudden violence. A man in his mid-30s, burned by sun and something harder than sun, his chest already open to 4s, his face the color of old paper. 2 flight medics were calling vitals, blood pressure 68/42 and dropping, heart rate 142, O2 sat 87 on high flow, GCS 14, let's move, let's move. The attending physician, not Sterling, thank God, was already walking, already assessing, his voice calm and precise, Bay 4, let's get him on the monitor, 2 large bore peripheral lines, type and cross for 6 units whole blood, get the surgeon, now. Laura stepped forward without being asked. Bay 4 was her assignment. She always knew it would be. The stretcher pulled alongside the bed and the transfer happened in that coordinated ballet that only happened with good teams, on 3, lift, swing, settle. The patient landed on the monitor bed with a dull thud of weight meeting metal, and his eyes opened for just a moment. Grey eyes. A Marine's eyes. Something in them that looked like recognition, or maybe that was just the confusion of hemorrhagic shock, the body's last desperate signals before it shut down. Laura moved. Gloved hands, antiseptic smell rising, the sharp burn of alcohol wipes. She was checking his right arm, looking for peripheral access, when she saw the tattoo. Small. On the inside of his wrist. Coordinates. Numbers arranged in that specific pattern she'd learned to read during Ramadi rotation, during the long operations, during the hours when precision meant the difference between a rescue and a recovery operation. Her hand stilled. Just for one breath. The numbers on that wrist matched exactly, to the decimal, the coordinates she'd written on a field dressing in September 2004. A 9-year-old boy. Black hair matted with blood from a collapsed building. Ramadi district, after the bombing near the marketplace. She'd pressed that field dressing against his abdomen and written the exact GPS coordinates with her own pen because the medevac was en route and he needed to stay conscious, and she'd said, memorize these numbers, okay? These numbers are where we're taking you. These numbers are home. She'd written them on the dressing tape in bold black pen, and his small fingers had traced them as the helicopter lifted away, and she'd never seen him again. That boy was 32 years old now, and he was dying on her table. Laura, where's that line? The attending's voice was urgent, not annoyed, but urgent. The monitor was beeping its anxious rhythm. BP dropping further, 65/38. Not enough perfusion. The body was beginning to shut down. Different systems failing in sequence like dominoes that only moved one direction. She inserted the second for without another pause. Movement, not thought. The needle went in smooth and clean, blood flashing back into the chamber, and she was already running the second bag of normal saline through the pump set to wide open. The attending was on the phone calling the surgeon. The nursing aide was applying pressure dressings to what looked like crush injuries across the lower abdomen. Laura's eyes were on the monitor, on the patient's respirations, on the subtle signs that were screaming louder than any alarm. BP's not responding to fluid resuscitation, the attending said. Not a question, just a statement of fact. A problem. Laura was listening to lung sounds. Right side clear. Left side diminished. The jugular veins were distended, standing out like cords against his neck. His heart rate was climbing higher, his pressure still falling despite 2 liters of fluid already running. And then she saw it, the central venous pressure on the monitor spiking, the cardiac waveform flattening just slightly, the clinical picture arranging itself into a single diagnosis that she'd seen in the field, in the back of a Black Hawk helicopter with nothing but a flashlight and her own hands. Pericardial tamponade. The pericardial sac, the membrane surrounding the heart, was filling with blood from one of the internal injuries. With each beat, the heart had less and less room to expand, less and less ability to pump. The fluid was compressing the heart itself, and the patient was running out of time. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the man bleeding out in front of her was the child she'd left behind 2 decades ago. Laura kept her face neutral. Her voice steady as stainless steel. Distended JVD, diminished breath sounds left side, rising CVP. Tamponade. 5 words. The attending looked at her sharply, then back at the monitor, reassessing. Understanding. Damn. Where's the surgeon? 14 minutes out from the OR. He's prepping but he's not here yet. 14 minutes. The patient had maybe 7. Maybe less. Laura was already pulling the crash cart closer, checking the defibrillation pads, the medication drawers, the intubation equipment. Her movements were precise. Economical. Nothing wasted. The attending watched her. You get extra training. Just observant, doctor. What she didn't say, I've done this in a sandstorm. I've done this in the back of a Black Hawk while rounds were cutting through the fuselage. I've done this with nothing but a 16-gauge needle and a prayer that my hands remembered what my brain had trained them to do. She didn't say any of that. She handed him the equipment he would need, the answers to questions he hadn't asked yet, and she stayed in the corner of her vision. The patient's eyes opened again. Those grey eyes. He looked directly at her, and for just a moment, she thought he might recognize her too. Thought he might say something. But then his eyes rolled back and the monitor alarmed a different alarm, the kind that meant his heart was working harder to fight the pressure, the kind that meant he was losing the battle in real time. The attending was excellent. Whatever he was doing to stabilize the patient, it was buying time. But time was still running out, and everyone in the room could feel it like static electricity. Laura's phone buzzed in her pocket, a reminder about medication reconciliation for a patient 3 rooms over. She silenced it without looking. Her eye stayed on the patient. On his wrist, where those coordinates were tattooed. Home, she'd told him. These numbers are home. The heart monitor kept its frantic rhythm. The fluids kept flowing. And somewhere in the building, a surgeon was scrubbing in, moving as fast as precision would allow, trying to reach a patient who might not have a heart left to repair. Laura's hands trembled. Not from fear. From restraint. From the terrible clarity of knowing exactly what should happen next, and knowing that if she spoke, if she suggested anything outside the standard protocol, Dr. Sterling would be waiting in the wings to file another complaint, another accusation of insubordination. She was just the nurse. And the boy she'd saved, the one she'd written coordinates for while his blood soaked her gloves, was running out of time. The monitors screamed first. At 0300, the commander's blood pressure collapsed like a building with its foundation removed, 120 down to 95 in seconds, then 80, then 70. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm as his oxygen saturation began its descent, 94, 91, 88. Laura was at the bedside before the alarm finished its first wail, her hands already moving, already knowing. The cardiac monitor showed the problem in jagged peaks and valleys, electrical activity, but no perfusion. No heartbeat strong enough to push blood through a body drowning in its own chest cavity. "He's in tamponade," Laura said. Not a question. A statement of fact delivered in a voice that sounded like she'd said it 1,000 times before, steady, metallic, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "Pericardial fluid." The bleeding didn't stop. Dr. Sterling was in the ICU on call, halfway down the corridor reviewing a patient chart. He heard the alarm. He did not run. He walked, deliberate and measured, and when he arrived at the commander's room, he took in the scene with the expression of a man watching a minor inconvenience unfold. Blood pressure 62 and dropping. Heart rate 142. The patient's extremities were cooling, mottled, shutting down. "Call cardiothoracic," Sterling said, pulling his phone from his pocket. Not a request. A directive. Chain of command. Protocol. The on-call surgeon was Dr. Brennan, someone Sterling knew, someone he'd have to report to, someone whose attention he wanted to control before the situation spiraled. He began scrolling through his contacts, his back to the patient, his focus on managing the conversation he was about to have rather than the man whose heart was about to stop. Laura didn't wait for permission. She moved to the bedside with the terrifying fluid precision of someone whose hands remembered things her mind had spent 2 years trying to forget. Gloves snapped like gunshots. An 18-gauge angiocath needle appeared in her right hand. She'd already grabbed it from the crash cart without breaking stride. She palpated the space between the 4th and 5th rib at the midclavicular line, her fingers reading bone and cartilage like a pianist reading sheet music. 1 moment to locate it. 2 seconds to feel the anatomical landmarks. The needle was in. "What are you doing?" Sterling spun around, phone still in his hand. Laura didn't answer. She never did answer when the work demanded everything. The needle advanced through skin, through the fibrous pericardium, and when the resistance suddenly released, when the giveaway came, she knew. The syringe attached to the needle hub filled with dark blood, 200 milliliters of it, maybe more, pooled between the heart and the membrane that was supposed to contain it. The pericardial sac was full. The heart was being crushed by its own blood. "Stop," Sterling said. "That is absolutely not." The blood drained. The pressure released. The heart, compressed and gasping, suddenly had room to expand. The monitor changed. 68, now 75, now 82. Sinus rhythm established itself in the middle of the chaos, a steady beat returning to the flat line that had been seconds away. The patient's color improved. Oxygen saturation climbed, 88, 91, 94, back toward normal. Her hands were still, her breathing even, her face blank as fresh snow. "Call cardiothoracic," she said to the resident, who was standing frozen against the wall. "Tell them we have a pericardiocentesis. Tamponade resolved. I need 2 units of blood, fresh frozen plasma, and a surgical team ready if this reaccumulates." She didn't look at Sterling. Didn't acknowledge the phone still in his hand. Didn't register his presence as anything more significant than a piece of furniture. The resident moved. The nurses moved. The machinery responded. And Dr. Sterling stood at the foot of the bed, face flushing from white to crimson, watching a nurse, just another disposable woman in scrubs, do the work he'd been trained for, the work he'd been credentialed for, the work that he'd somehow forgotten how to do under pressure. By 0600, 3 phone calls had left his contact list. By 0800, the CEO of Sacred Heart had received a detailed account of Laura's unauthorized procedure and gross violation of scope of practice. By 0900, 2 hospital board members had been contacted. By noon, the paperwork was complete. Laura was suspended effective immediately, pending a formal inquiry into practicing medicine without a license, unlicensed medical procedures on vulnerable patients, and insubordination. Sterling had weaponized the only institution that had ever made sense to him. If he could not break her with his presence, he would break her with the machinery of power. But that wasn't the worst part. 72 hours later, Laura sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room of the VA Medical Center in Raleigh, filling out intake forms with hands that trembled so badly the pen kept slipping from her fingers. The panic attacks had started the morning after her suspension, not gradually, not building, but sudden and total, like something inside her chest had been holding its breath for 2 years and had finally, catastrophically, let go. She'd tried to sleep. Couldn't. Tried to eat. Couldn't. Tried to sit still without feeling the walls contracting. She was a patient now. Not a provider. Not senior chief. Just a woman with PTSD paperwork and a medical history that stretched back 2 decades, sitting in a room full of young people with haunted eyes and bounce-back knees and the particular stillness that comes from having seen things that shouldn't be seen. The Marine corporal across from her couldn't have been older than 23. Leg bouncing like a jackhammer, jaw clenched so hard you could see the muscle working, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall. He looked like every combat vet she'd ever treated. She could see his wounds from across the room, not physical, but the others, the kind that made breathing difficult in enclosed spaces. She used to help people like him. She used to be the steady hand, the calm voice, the one who knew what panic felt like and could talk you down from the edge of it. Now she was the one filling out the boxes. PTSD, yes. Depression, yes. Suicidal ideation, she hesitated on that one for 3 seconds before checking the box. Numbness had always been easier than the alternative. The intake counselor called her name at 14:30. Laura stood on shaking legs and followed a woman in a VA badge into a small office that smelled like machine coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. They talked about her discharge, her symptoms, the 2 years she'd spent trying to be invisible. The counselor asked about her current support system. Laura said nothing. Asked about her medication. Laura said she'd stopped taking it 6 months after leaving the Navy. Asked what brought her in today. The panic, Laura said. It was all she could manage. Somewhere in Arlington, Virginia, military intelligence officers were reviewing a patient file from Sacred Heart Hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina. The pericardiocentesis technique caught their attention because it was unusual, the angle was wrong for standard protocol, the approach was modified, the decision to perform it without supervision spoke to a level of expertise that didn't match the credentials on file. A nurse, the chart said. Registered nurse. But the technique was specific. The precision was specific. The calm under pressure was specific. One of the officers pulled a database from 2001. Training records for Naval Special Warfare combat medics. 3 names matched the profile, 3 women who'd gone through the program, who'd been deployed to Ramadi, who'd logged the exact kind of combat saves that would make someone good at field medicine. One of them had served in 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. One of them had a Navy Cross. One of them had disappeared from all records in 2006. They cross-referenced the commander's tattoo. Coordinates. Latitude and longitude. They plotted them on a map. Ramadi, Jolan District, 2004. They pulled deployment records from that date. They found a name, a rank, a photograph from a personnel file, Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. Combat medic. 3 Navy Crosses. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. Purple Heart. Navy and Marine Corps Medal. 73 documented combat saves, though the real number was likely higher, documented only in field notes and memory. The file ended in 2006. Medical discharge. PTSD. No forwarding address. No forwarding contact. The woman had evaporated like smoke. Now they knew where she was. The machinery of the US military had not forgotten. It had only been looking. At 19:45 that evening, Dr. Sterling sat in his office on the 4th floor of Sacred Heart, preparing his presentation for the Hospital Ethics Board. It was scheduled for 0800 the next morning. He'd invited the CEO. He'd invited the press. He'd prepared a statement about patient safety and the dangers of allowing untrained personnel to perform invasive procedures. He'd prepared documentation. He'd prepared witnesses. He'd prepared everything except for what was about to arrive at his hospital's front entrance like a storm system that couldn't be deflected by policy or credential or the measured weight of institutional authority. The convoy began rolling north on Interstate 95 at 2100 that night. 2 Hums, a transport truck, and a chartered bus carrying 200 Marines in dress blues. They drove through the darkness with the kind of discipline that comes from knowing exactly where you're going and why. They drove like soldiers had driven for centuries, with purpose, with numbers, with the absolute certainty that the institution behind them would not accept failure. They were coming to bring one of their own home. Diesel engines growled outside Sacred Heart Hospital at 0800 on the 4th morning. Not one vehicle. Not 2. A full convoy, Hums rolling in formation, their heavy frames blocking the emergency bay entrance like a siege. The nurses at the front desk looked up from their screens. The orderlies stopped moving. Something massive was arriving, and the building could feel it the way prey feels a predator crossing into range. The Marines came next. 200 of them, exactly 200, moving through the sliding glass doors in dress blue so crisp they looked like they'd been cut from steel. Their boots hit the tile in perfect synchronization, a sound like distant thunder, like the earth itself was marching. Tap, 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 tap. Not a single voice. Not a single question. Just 200 warriors in formation, moving with a kind of unified purpose that made the fluorescent lights seem dimmer by comparison. The commanding officer stepped forward and asked the front desk clerk a single question, loud enough that every staff member within 100 feet froze mid-motion. "Where is Senior Chief Bennett?" The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the ICU doors opened. Commander Rashid stood in the doorway despite explicit medical orders. The wounds were still fresh, bandages wrapped around his torso, his left arm moving carefully as he'd been instructed. But a man doesn't spend 2 decades in the Marines sitting down when his rescuer is being formally received by his unit. He walked out on shaking legs, and the first thing he said reached every corner of the lobby like a radio broadcast. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett saved my life twice. Once in Ramadi when I was 9 years old. Once this week in your ICU." The words hung in the air like a physical thing. Nurses turned to each other. Residents whispered. And Laura, standing at the medication station, her hand steady, her face showing nothing, went absolutely still. Not trembling. Not crying. Just a single breath held, then released, as the recognition crashed down on her like a wave she'd been preparing for her entire career without knowing it. The Marines parted as a Marine colonel stepped forward, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who'd carried authority across 3 continents. He held something against his chest, a service jacket, navy blue with gold buttons, the fabric worn in places from decades of wear. The jacket of a warrior who'd actually lived the rank. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett," he said, and his voice moved through the hospital like wind through a canyon. He opened the jacket, and the lobby saw what Sacred Heart never had, rows of medals, ribbons stacked like a soldier's entire history told in color. He began reading them aloud, giving each one its own beat, its own moment of weight. 3 Navy Crosses. The Marines behind him stood taller. 2 Bronze Stars with Valor. A nurse gasped. Purple Heart. The words continued, each one placing another brick on top of what everyone believed they'd known. Navy and Marine Corps Medal. The colonel paused, letting the silence build. 73 documented combat saves. 73 lives. Not as a myth. Not as a story. As a fact, recorded and verified and carried by the United States Marine Corps in permanent files. Laura's eyes remained fixed on a point somewhere beyond the lobby, but her jaw had clenched just slightly. Not from fear. From the weight of a secret finally becoming public, from a decade and a half of carrying something alone suddenly being set down in front of everyone who'd ever doubted her. That was when the vehicles outside stopped. The sound of boots on pavement ceased. And a new voice entered Sacred Heart, one that came with authority so absolute that even the ventilators seemed to quiet in deference. A 2-star general. Not photographs. Not stories. the actual living, breathing embodiment of command, walking through those doors with hospital board members flanking him like courtiers. Behind them, local news cameras, alerted by military convoy dispatch scanners hours earlier, were already rolling. They'd been waiting outside. They knew something was about to collapse, and they positioned themselves to catch it on tape. The general turned to face Dr. Sterling, who stood frozen near the nurse's station, his arms crossed, his face cycling through shades of pale as he realized the cameras were pointing at him. "Are you Dr. Sterling?" the general asked. The question hung in the air like a weapon dropped at point-blank range. Sterling nodded. His voice came out smaller than it had ever sounded in that hospital. I reported the protocol violation to protect patients from." The general cut him off with a single raised hand. "You suspended a decorated Navy Cross recipient for saving a Marine commander's life using a procedure she's performed 57 times under fire. You delayed care. You weaponized institutional authority against a veteran. And you did it on camera in front of this hospital." The CEO stepped forward, pale and sweating, looking at Sterling the way a man looks at something he's just realized is going to destroy his career too. The general handed him a folder. The CEO's hand shook as he opened it. "Full military review of Commander Rashid's care," the general said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. Dr. Sterling's delays constituted gross negligence. His retaliation against Senior Chief Bennett violated federal protections for service members. His termination is not a recommendation. It's a requirement. The CEO read silently, his breathing getting shallow. He looked at Sterling, and his next words came out like a judge passing sentence: "Your contract is terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." Sterling's face went from white to red in the space of a heartbeat. His mouth opened. "You can't do this. I have board connections. 15 years here. I was protecting." "Your board connections," the general said, his tone suggesting he was explaining something to someone too slow to understand, "are being investigated for enabling harassment of a veteran. Your 15 years ended the moment you chose ego over a patient's life." Two security officers approached Sterling from either side. He tried to move away, but the lobby had become a fishbowl, every phone pointed at him, every staff member bearing witness, every camera rolling as his authority dissolved like salt in water. He was still protesting, still claiming he'd been right, still searching for some institutional power to leverage. But the Marines stood motionless around him, and the general watched with the kind of calm that comes from having already decided how this would end. They escorted Sterling toward the exit. The doors opened. The convoy was still there outside, still blocking the emergency bay, still making it clear that this was a military operation now. The last thing anyone saw of Dr. Sterling was his silhouette moving past the glass doors, past the uniforms, toward a parking lot where his own vehicle waited like a refuge that could no longer protect him. Inside Sacred Heart, the cameras kept rolling. The Marine stood silent. Laura Bennett remained motionless at the medication station, watching the service jacket with her medals as the colonel carefully held it, waiting. She'd spent 2 decades invisible, and in the space of one morning, she was being asked to step into a spotlight she'd once held and then fled from. But that wasn't the worst part for Sterling. The worst part came 6 months later. Someone spotted him at a strip mall on the outskirts of Raleigh, sitting alone at a folding table under a hand-painted banner that read, "Supplemental Insurance, Ask Me How." His expensive watch was gone. His crisp white coat had been replaced by a polyester polo shirt with a company logo. When former colleagues from Sacred Heart walked by, he turned his face away. The phones kept ringing, his lawyers, his board members, his network of allies, but no one was picking up. The files from the military review had been leaked to the state medical board. His 15 years of accumulated authority had been rebuilt from scratch by people who found out exactly what kind of man had been standing in that ICU, poisoning the well. 6 months after that, Laura Bennett stood on a stage at the Navy Medical Center in Portsmouth. 200 Marines filled the auditorium. The same ones who'd walked into Sacred Heart. They rose to salute as she was introduced, Director of Combat Trauma Training. She wore her dress uniform for the first time in 16 years, and the weight of those medals against her chest felt like coming home. The faded unit patch, the one from Ramadi, the one she'd kept hidden inside her jacket lining for a decade, was now sewn on the outside, visible to everyone. You could see the coordinates marked on it, the one she'd written in field dressing for a 9-year-old boy who was now Commander Rashid, standing in the front row, fully healed, saluting the woman who'd saved him twice. Laura gripped the podium with both hands. The leather was warm. The lights were bright. She'd spent 6 years hiding from the weight of who she was, thinking that anonymity was healing. It wasn't. It was just running. I spent time in the VA waiting room, she said, and her voice was steady. Panic attacks. Isolation. I thought maybe I wasn't fit for anything anymore, not even the job I'd spent my whole career perfecting. She paused. The auditorium was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. Then 200 Marines walked into a hospital and reminded me that service isn't about the uniform. It's about showing up when someone needs saving. The applause began before she finished. Commander Rashid saluted. The Marines stood. The nurses from Sacred Heart who'd quit after Sterling's firing, who were now training under Laura, rose with tears on their faces. To every veteran struggling in silence, Laura continued, her voice carrying across the auditorium like a transmission being received by everyone who needed to hear it. To every healer who feels broken, you do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You just need to keep showing up. The Marines erupted. 200 voices, one unified roar of acknowledgement. Laura touched the unit patch, feeling the coordinates beneath her fingertips. 20 years. From Ramadi to Raleigh to redemption. After the ceremony, she met with young Navy medics preparing for deployment. They asked how she'd managed. How she'd survived. How she'd come back from invisible. I didn't survive well, she told them. But I'm surviving now. And that's enough. She drove back to Raleigh one afternoon and parked across from Sacred Heart. The ICU was visible through the windows on the 3rd floor. There was a small plaque on the wall now, something she hadn't expected, in honor of Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, Navy Cross. She sat in her car for a long time, just looking. Then she drove to the VA hospital instead. In the waiting room, a young Marine with shaking hands sat alone. Laura recognized the look, the 1,000-yard stare of someone drowning in their own mind. She sat down beside him. First time here, she asked. He nodded. It gets better, she said. I promise. She stayed with him until his name was called. Then she went home, not hiding anymore, not running, just existing as the warrior she'd always been. The quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. And sometimes, that person deserves the chance to be seen. If you survived this story with us, hit subscribe. Share Laura's journey with someone who needs to know that heroes walk among us, often unrecognized, often in scrubs instead of dress blues. And comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Because every single one of you has a story worth telling.